It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. With me today, Conservative peer Daniel Hannan, SNP MP Richard Thompson, Managing Director of the supermarket chain Iceland Richard Walker, and the Sunday Times' political editor Caroline Wheeler. This was last night.
The ayes to the right, 250. The noes to the left, 232.
A vote which left the government accused of corruption. Today, after a furious backlash, a U-turn.
I fear last night's debate conflated the individual case with the general concern. This link needs to be broken.
The opposition says Boris Johnson is to blame.
What you've got with this Prime Minister is a Prime Minister who is leading his troops through the sewer.
The MP at the centre of the storm, Owen Paterson, will now face a new vote on his alleged misconduct.
Greenwashing has got to stop.
Climate activists accuse governments and businesses of so-called green sheen. Is that fair? And rows over fishing. Is this what sovereignty was meant to look like? In the last hour, the government has performed the most extraordinary U-turn on its plans to overhaul the system for investigating MPs after a furious backlash. Yesterday, Number 10 threw its support behind reforming the Standards Committee and effectively blocking a vote to suspend the former Cabinet Minister, Owen Paterson. The Common Standards Committee had recommended he be suspended for 30 days for what they called an egregious breach of lobbying rules. Labour said that the Tories were just wanting to let off one of their own. Let's have a look at the verdict in some of the papers this morning. The Daily Mail: shameless MPs sink back into sleaze. This was the headline on the front page of The Guardian. Prime Minister accused of corruption as rules on sleaze torn up. And this finally on the Eye. Tories rip up Britain's anti-sleaze rules to save guilty MP. Let's talk to our political correspondent, Jonathan Blake. Jonathan, government attempts to overhaul the way MPs are policed have completely backfired.
They have, Jo, and that's why we've seen a very rapid U-turn this morning. If the tone of yesterday's debate on this in the House of Commons wasn't enough to tell ministers that they were pursuing a course of action that would quickly become difficult for them, then the resulting front pages this morning and continuing reaction to what the government was attempting to do yesterday has really meant that they were left, I think, with no choice this morning but to pull the plug on these plans and think again. And so Jacob Rees-Mogg, the leader of the House of Commons, stood up shortly after 10:30 this morning and announced that the government would pursue, on a cross-party basis, a different approach to reforming the way the rules governing MPs' behaviour are enforced.
I fear last night's debate conflated the individual case with the general concern. This link needs to be broken. Therefore, I and others will be looking to work on a cross-party basis to achieve improvements in our system for future cases. We will bring forward more detailed proposals once there have been cross-party discussions.
So that was Jacob Rees-Mogg in the Commons about an hour ago. Jonathan, what's the opposition saying?
Well, Thangam Debonair, the shadow leader, stood up and said she was astonished at what the government was doing, although ministers had argued from the start that it was never their intention to link the case of Owen Paterson with the attempt to overhaul the system. The effect, of course, was that yesterday's vote did indeed pause, at least, his suspension from the House of Commons for 30 days, which is what he was facing, and allowed Labour and others to accuse the government of trying to get one of their own MPs off the hook. And in the last hour, the leader of the Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer, has given his reaction in strong terms.
Well, what's happened in the last 24 hours is corrupt. I mean, there was no other word for it, I'm afraid. In order to protect one of their own, the government of the Prime Minister voted to pull the entire independent standards process down. And it's no wonder that this morning they're waking up and asking themselves what on earth they've done.
So, Jonathan, what next?
Well, there will be another vote, we're told, on specifically the case of Owen Paterson and whether he should be suspended for 30 days, as the Commons Standards Committee suggested. We don't know exactly when that will be, possibly next week at some point. The Liberal Democrats have called for an urgent emergency debate on standards in Parliament in general. That's been granted, and we expect that to happen on Monday. As for the government's attempts to reform the cross-party approach to enforcing the rules that MPs have to abide by, well, that looks very uncertain now, and they will attempt to take it forward, but they're not exactly starting from a position of much goodwill from the opposition parties in the House of Commons, and indeed with a good deal of anger on the Conservative benches too, where many MPs are feeling that this just wasn't a fight the government needed to pick, and the way it's gone about it has left it in a considerably weaker position.
Jonathan Blake there, thank you very much. Dan Hannan, has the government now made the right decision to rethink the plans and separate the case of Owen Paterson from its call to overhaul the plans?
Plainly, it was the right thing to separate those two cases, because dealing with the problems in response to a specific case was bound to conflate the issues, as you just heard Jacob Rees-Mogg saying. Honestly, I think the whole system of MPs regulation is wrong. I think it infantilises the electorate, and I think it encourages worse behaviour from MPs. I'm of the view that there should be a very powerful external regulator that can sack MPs like that without giving them any explanation, and it should be called the electorate.
Right.
And anything that comes between the electorate and the MPs and presumes to dictate what's allowed and what isn't, tends to replace a culture of conscience with a culture of compliance. It encourages MPs to say, is this technically legal, rather than is this the right thing
I mean,
to do?
people will argue that there does need to be some sort of parliamentary system to police or investigate
MPs. Until the early 90s,
well, all right,
and have MPs started behaving better since
Others
then?
can discuss that. But let's go back to the way the government has behaved. You say it was the right decision, so you agree that the two had been conflated. Do you think that was deliberate on the part of the government to try, as Labour said, to get off Owen Paterson from facing a vote on his suspension when he had been found in breach of lobbying rules, very clearly, making money from two companies?
No, I'm afraid it's something that I've been critical of quite a lot with this administration, which is to leave everything to the last minute. They had lots of opportunities when they could have reformed the expenses system or the oversight system in peacetime. They could have done so, for example, when the PM was last exonerated over his investigation. That wouldn't have looked remotely suspicious. Instead of which, they did this I'm afraid, this typical thing of waiting until their hand was forced.
Was it corrupt?
Was
it corrupt the way they behaved? Was it
so.
sleazy in order, as you say, they could have done it at any point, and they decided to do it on the day of the vote of a former Conservative cabinet minister?
So they should have done it before, and that was a mistake. Honestly, in terms of the issue, and it's difficult for MPs to say this, but I was never an MP, so let me say it. I always think the real test when an MP is accused of corruption is, did they go through a moment of thinking, I hope the Sunday Times never finds out about this?
Right.
Because almost all of us, almost all politicians have at some stage filled in a form incorrectly.
Sure. But let's be clear, the corruption allegation is, we're not talking necessarily about the case here of Owen Paterson. The corruption allegation and the sleaze allegations are about the way the government's behaved over this.
I think it is right to tackle what is obviously a system that is set up incorrectly. It was a massive overreaction to the expenses scandal. It means that the investigator, the prosecutor and the judge are all combined in one person. There's no appeal, there's no oversight. That is a system that was plainly failing.
Right. Caroline, how does this look in terms of the government's behaviour? We already heard there from my colleague, Jonathan Blake, that there were dozens of Conservative MPs deeply uncomfortable. Many of them abstained. One of them sat here where Dan Hannan is yesterday, saying that she felt uncomfortable, although she did then go ahead and vote in favour of a review of the system, blocking it. It clearly looked so bad that the government changed its mind.
Absolutely. It looked really smelly looking at it from the outside. And I think rightly there were lots of front pages today, including, I think, the Daily Mail, extraordinary big supporter of the government generally, 6 pages dedicated to, the suggestion that there had been a whiff of corruption around this. And I think, yes, the issues were conflated, and that's what's presented some of those difficulties. But it's not just that they were conflated. I mean, actually what the government was proposing was to rip up the entire standard system and replace it with what, people have described as a kangaroo court. Now, this is because the opposition party was saying that they weren't going to agree to collaborate collaborate in this, which was effectively going to leave it with the Conservative Party marking its own homework. So yes, I think there is undoubtedly a real whiff around this, and I think that's what people have reacted to today. And of course, I mean, it is extraordinary. We saw even the Business Secretary this morning going out onto the airwaves to defend the government's decision and to talk about this in those terms, and saying that actually Catherine Stone, the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner, was going to find it very difficult to hang on to her job. And yet within a matter of minutes, if not an hour, we see Jacob Rees-Mogg standing up and saying that we need to now, extrapolate these two particular positions. But I think the government is going to find itself in an incredibly difficult position now, given the feeling amongst the Labour Party and other opposition parties about the way forward. And I think, they still seem to be sticking to this notion that they want to have an appeal, some sort of appeal system incorporated into this process. But actually, I think what you'll find is that the Labour Party in particular will now use this as an opportunity to really beef up the powers around this. And of course, it comes on the back of Lord Evans's report on lobbying only earlier this week.
Well, Richard, this is a good time, Richard Thompson, to bring you in. I'll come to you, Richard Walker, in just a moment. Is the SNP now prepared to collaborate on a cross-party basis in the way we just heard Jacob Rees-Mogg in the House set out on a new committee or a new system for policing MPs?
Well, those discussions are ongoing. We certainly weren't prepared to work with the committee as it was being proposed last night. That was just a complete corruption of the process. While we're talking corruption. But these discussions are ongoing. But fundamentally, if you're going to make any substantive change to the way that MPs are regulated and the standards process that I think has to be in there, then it has to be done on a collaborative cross-party basis, which is respectful of the fact that the government has a majority, but is also respectful of the views of the opposition. And if that is now what is going to happen, then that is a much better place than we were in last night. But if I could just say, I'm astounded at the hypocrisy of Jacob Rees-Mogg in the Commons earlier saying that there had been some conflation of the person in the process, because that was precisely what the motion that they put before us was doing, and we were accused of being political for anyone who had the temerity to point that out to them in the chamber last night.
Sorry, Richard, I will come to you, I promise, in just a moment. You said it was a mistake, Dan Hannan, to do that, to proceed in the way the government did. You're a vice chair of the Conservative Party. Did you make your feelings clear?
Well, it all happened rather fast, so no, I haven't had any conversations about this, but I have made my feelings very clear over 20 years that the whole of this regulatory process, including IPSA, is bad because the only judge and jury in a democracy should be the people. And I would have much stronger recall procedures that wouldn't require going through this committee, that would allow any, once you've reached a threshold, any group of constituents to force a by-election. I would strengthen the regulatory power of the electorate as a whole, rather than inserting these quangos in between.
Richard, watching this from your perspective as a businessman, what did you make of the argument yesterday put forward by Boris Johnson and other senior Conservative MPs that actually members of Parliament should be treated in the same way as people in other walks of life and be given a right to reply, as you might in some sort of court case or tribunal outside the Palace of Westminster?
Yeah, I mean, look, clearly I don't know the rights and wrongs of this specifically. I acknowledge it's a very complicated situation, but I think clearly Owen Paterson does feel that he's been treated unfairly and unjustly. And I feel compassion for him, by the way, on a personal level as well, given the situation that he's gone through. And I think he should be given a chance to respond, absolutely. What's clear, just as a bystander looking in, that there is clearly a lot of grey in this process. So transparency, due process is all vital, but it's clear that the policies, the practices need to be reviewed. So let's wait and see the outcome of the next vote. And I'll wait with interest.
Do you have sympathy with Owen Paterson's case in that sense that he perhaps should have a right to reply? He's rejected the findings.
I have great sympathy with his personal circumstances, but yes, I think he has if we're going to reform the process going forward, I think perhaps there is an argument that there is a greater opportunity for input from the person facing the accusations to respond to that. My understanding is that's what's all rolled up in the report that has been considered by the committee. And the role of Parliament last night was to properly decide whether or not it was prepared to accept those recommendations, and if so, what sanction to place upon them. That is the problem that we're facing. So the problem I had with this is we were saying that this process lacked natural justice. which implies that every other case that has been considered under this procedure also lacked natural justice. So there's a fouling of every set of proceedings that had gone before in the government's desperation to get this through, which I think was very, very irresponsible. But if we want to look at having some sort of form of appeal there, that's absolutely fine. But we also have to be clear about what the role of Parliament is in that.
Right. In terms of Owen Paterson himself, Caroline, once Jacob Rees-Mogg had stood up in the House of Commons, the leader of the House of Commons, and announced that the government was ditching its original plans, I spoke to him briefly. I called him to get his reaction before we came on air. And despite the significance of this and the impact it will have on him personally, because there will now be a vote on his suspension, he didn't know anything about it. I mean, the government hadn't told him.
Well, that would suggest the speed at which the government moved this morning. And I think, as I said before, that was indicative of the fact that we still saw a government minister doing the broadcast rounds this morning, still defending what, many were describing as indefensible this morning. So I think the government has moved at huge speed. I think it's going to be very difficult for Owen Paterson, given all of the very personal things that are wrapped up in this particular case. And I'm sure that we'll hear more from him over the weekend about what he intends to do, given, how vociferously he's defended himself, particularly in relation to this case.
I mean, what do you make of the fact that he didn't even know about it, bearing in mind the two had been conflated?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think we can all agree that the presentation has been lamentable and politically disastrous. One of the things that being in politics has taught me is that most people's definition of corruption tends to overlap almost 100% with their definition of holds views with which I disagree, and that means that there's a
the front pages of the papers, lend and actually support a different viewpoint.
Because the general view since the expenses crisis is that all MPs should be housed in barracks and watched over by wardens and not allowed to make phone calls. I honestly think that this creation of this superstructure of people determining who's fit and proper. I think that is a removal of the rights of the electorate, and it's something I feel very strongly about. Being a democracy means trusting voters. If they think their MP is lazy, or if they disagree, it doesn't have to be corruption. Give them greater power.
Well, Richard, responding to that.
Well, I think we have that ultimate accountability every 5 years or so at elections, but there has to be a mechanism for dealing with poor behaviour and diminished standards in between times.
Recall.
As well.
Recall.
And recall is part of that. But part of the problem, again, last night was the government retrospectively trying to shift the goalposts. Whereas a few weeks ago, we had a discussion about another Conservative MP who had fallen foul of the Standards Commission for their behaviour. But yet we were told we couldn't retrospectively change that process in order to allow the sort of recall that you're talking about. So let's get the standards process in order. There has to be one. Recall has a very important role to play in that. But I don't think we can leave it
Richard,
to every 5 years.
You say there has to be one. I honestly, before Nolan and Sleaze in the early 90s, there wasn't one. We trusted constituents to hold people to account. Now, do we honestly think that the behaviour of MPs is substantially better now than it was 30 years ago as a result of having all these quangos? I would really struggle to make that case.
But it's not about us trusting constituents to do that. It's about constituents having trust in their elected members. And I think we do need to have those processes in place to give constituents the opportunity to judge them correctly, to see who's to praise and who's to blame for their behaviour and their actions in office at election time in the normal run of things, but also to make sure that MPs are able to be subject to that recall where their conduct has fallen below an objective standard that is expected of them.
Richard Walker, where are you on this?
Sorry, say that again?
I'm hoping you heard the discussion before I asked the question, otherwise it'll be difficult for you to respond. Where are you on the
idea? Cut out then.
That's all right. Where are you on the discussion between our two guests here in the studio about whether it should be left to recall, it should always be the decision of constituents, of voters, or whether there should be bodies here that judge suspected poor behaviour of MPs?
Well, I think ultimately voters have the say, right? But of course, we do need regulation and regulators, but they also have to be transparent and they have to follow a due process that everyone understands. And as I said earlier, there's clearly just quite a lot of cloak and dagger and grey here, and there's clearly a lot of dissatisfaction. So I think that whole process needs to be reviewed and tightened up.
I mean, Caroline, one of the issues is that 19 of the Conservative MPs who backed the amendment to review the system yesterday and block the suspension effectively of Owen Paterson have had complaints against them upheld by the Committee on Standards, and 3 others are currently under investigation. Can you see why people might think that Sleaze is back?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, if you look at that, there's only one conclusion to draw from that, which is, OK, yes, they were told that they had to vote for it. I mean, interestingly, it was Jacob Rees-Mogg that wrote to MPs yesterday and asked them to support this amendment. But actually, when you have people who have a vested interest in ripping up the system, it does raise very serious questions. And just in response to the question you asked the other guests about why we need these bodies in there, if we think about why they were set up, we had an expenses scandal where, there was just absolutely no trust in the system at all. And one of the reasons why these bodies were set up was to restore trust in our politicians. And also, yes, OK, I understand we have a recall process and that's very important that the electorate play their role in it. But if we don't have a system that actually investigates this, how are we going to find out what actually ever happened? Yes, we have a function in terms of the media, in terms of bringing those stories to the public's fore. But at the same time, those bodies actually go, they speak to witnesses, they talk to people, they really probe into what the concerns are. And if that weren't the case, then the electorate would never know half of the things that we know.
I think you're doing your paper a disservice. I think you're brilliant at bringing those things before the electorate. The original proposal for recall, of which I was a huge supporter, is that if you got to a high enough number of signatures that it wouldn't be used frivolously, 10% or whatever, then you could have a recall and it wouldn't need to be for correction.
But how would they know? How would they know the information?
We wouldn't presume to second-guess them. That would be up to the electorate. The problem is that what happens now is that it's effectively up to a committee of other MPs who may not like you on a personal level, who may have a partisan grudge against you, to decide who can be taken out.
There were a number of Conservative MPs on this committee.
Sure, I know that. But that's the structural weakness in the... And I just wonder, if I may, on Caroline's important point about the expenses scandal, that, it seems to me, was an exact demonstration of what's wrong with regulation. Because if you remember, almost every MP from all the parties who was caught up in that crisis, they all said the same thing, which is, what I did was technically within the rules, which was true. So the problem was that this regulatory system had encouraged them to do things that were technically compliant, rather than asking themselves the broad question, is this the right thing to do? And that's why I'm against having these regulators. I think it skews the incentives and makes MPs behave more badly.
Just before we move on, do you think the charge of sleaze will stick?
Almost certainly, because people are sort of predisposed almost always to think that politicians are sleazy, pretty much regardless of the facts of the case. Yeah.
On that note, let's move on. And let me show you this headline in the Evening Standard. Supermarket Iceland pledges to become plastic neutral from 2022. Richard, what exactly does plastic neutral mean?
Effectively, we're offsetting all of the remaining plastic that we haven't yet eliminated by funding local, municipal and community clean-ups and recycling efforts in countries with high waste leakage, which basically means poor recycling infrastructure. Now, it's a supplementary, quite a radical idea, but it doesn't take away from our primary focus of removing all plastic from our own label foods, which we've committed to do.
Right, because I haven't done so already, I should just say that you are in Glasgow at the Climate Summit, the COP26 there, so people understand the backdrop and, of course, the issue we're talking about. Now, Greenpeace have responded to your plan and called it little more than a creative accounting trick. What would you say in response?
I think I understand that we can't recycle our way out of the plastic crisis. There was a UN report published last week which shows that plastic is locked in, out of control. Ecologically, it's having impacts on climate and human health. So I absolutely agree with Greenpeace that we need to focus on elimination first, which we are doing. But given the damning status of that report, I think it's absolutely critical, and I'm calling on all supermarkets to do the same, to offset and recycle all of the remaining plastic that they're still responsible for, which in Iceland's case is still a lot. It's about 7,000 tonnes a year. Now, we're motivated to get that down, and of course this offset is costing us millions of pounds, which hopefully it will get cheaper as we start to reduce our plastic footprint.
All right,
but I think it's better than not doing it.
OK, well, let's welcome Sam Dimitriou, Research Director at the Entrepreneurs Network. Sam, hopefully you've just heard what Richard said about the plastic neutral plan. What do you make of it?
I think it's interesting because a lot of corporate efforts and sort of general efforts to go green rely on intuitions that are sometimes faulty about what is and isn't actually good for the environment. And I think sometimes they can lead us to focus on the wrong problem. So take food packaging, right? So it's obviously reasonable to try to reduce plastic use where possible, but sometimes packaging serves a really, really valuable purpose. So in response to a recent Greenpeace petition, the broadcaster and botanist James Wong, he tweeted that wrapping broccoli in plastic doubles its shelf life, massively reducing food waste. And for scale of food waste for a country, it would lag behind only the US and China in terms of its carbon emission. So there's a problem that sometimes we focus on things that are very easy and visible, but miss the real problem, which is something like food waste, which we don't see as often, and those carbon emissions, which are obviously invisible and we can't actually see them in the atmosphere.
Right, Richard, your response to that? You've gone for the easy, visible thing, but not perhaps the issue of cutting down food waste.
No, that's true. I mean, cucumbers, exactly the same. You wrap them in plastic, they last 4 times longer. When removing plastic, we don't want to inadvertently create another problem. And of course, environmentalism is full of the law of unintended consequences. So we're very careful, and that's why it is taking time. It is frustrating with our journey to become plastic free, but we believe it's possible, and we believe that there are alternatives. I should say, plastic is fantastic. It's a miracle material, but it's our frivolous use of it which is the problem. It's the throwaway single-use culture, something like a plastic bottle which can last for 500 million years, just so fleeting, perhaps a minute to drink it and then it's thrown away. So we need to readdress our relationship with materials and our use of them.
Right, Sam, so do you think this is a good strategy to try and achieve some sort of net zero plan for companies like Iceland?
Well, I think if you're offsetting it in projects that actually improve how the waste is disposed of rather than the production itself, actually that can be really helpful, because we know that a lot of the problems with plastic is actually in the waste management process rather than in the actual use process. But I think there's a sort of a broader point, and that we need to be very, very careful when we try and be green or not, when we try to be green, because I think we often focus on things that are tangible and visible, but sometimes the problem is kind of different. So a classic example is food miles. So production, not transportation, is where the main source of emissions from food come from. So one study found that if you import Spanish lettuce in the winter, it would cut emissions by 3 to 8 times compared to growing it locally. So we should think of things like buying lettuce from Spain as importing renewable sunshine from abroad. So we sometimes focus on these wrong problems. I think what we really need to do is align market forces with environmental goals. That means applying the polluter pays principle and placing a tax or a fee on all carbon use. That way it creates incentives for businesses to develop cleaner technologies and consumers to switch. And we know this works. That's why the electricity we buy is powered by renewables and gas rather than dirty coal. And consumers who want to go green, they no longer have to fret about these whole life cycle analyses of the environmental cost of their consumption. They simply have to look after number one and find the cheaper product, the best value for money. And I think that's ultimately where we need to go. All
right, you're nodding, Richard. Would you do that?
Yeah, I think... I think what we must do is democratise environmentalism, because so far it's been the preserve of the Waitrose customers who can afford to pay more for the privilege. And of course, Iceland serves the poorest communities around the UK. Therefore, everything that we're doing has to be cost neutral for our customers, because some of them only have 25 quid a week to spend on food. I agree with the interviewer that actually we need to do all of it. And that's why we're committed to halving our food waste. We've eliminated palm oil. We're going to be net zero carbon by 2040. But I'm the first to admit that Iceland is not a sustainable business. In fact, there is no such thing, because there's nothing out there, there's no business out there that puts more back into nature than it takes away from it. But I think let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Let's do what we can where we can, and that's simply what we're trying to do. So I don't think it's greenwashing, but we're just trying to do better where we can.
All right, let me bring in the other guests. Richard here in the studio, 2 Richards. Do you think it is greenwashing? Do you think these tangible things that companies like Iceland are doing, maybe better than not doing anything at all, but they don't amount to very much?
I think there's a real danger of greenwashing, and that the public relations aspect of it is more significant than the environmental benefits that arise from that. I don't necessarily think that's the case with what Iceland are doing. I mean, certainly from what I've heard there, if you can find replacements for plastics, we all know why plastics are used. It's to preserve the quality and the appearance of it. Some of that is down to what consumers expect to see, so that when they go into a supermarket and look at the shelf. So there's maybe a bit of consumer education goes on there. But anything that can mitigate is good and useful in its own terms. But fundamentally, the challenge is to find suitable ways of packaging and distributing that does not have the same environmental impact. Because the plastic problem that we're facing, particularly when it comes to polluting our oceans, is very, very serious indeed. So if we can find ways not to have plastic in the system to begin with, despite the fact it is a fantastic product for many, many different applications, if we can find ways to reduce and preferably eliminate the plastic going into the system to begin with, that will get us to a much better place.
Is the focus correct?
I mean, I thought what Richard Walker was doing there was great, and I thought it was churlish to complain about a company doing its best within its resources.
But is it going to actually impact,
yes,
bringing down carbon emissions?
Well, I mean, so the plastics thing is going to impact the amount of plastics waste at least coming from this part of the world. It's worth dwelling for a second on the fact that we're at least in the luxurious place of being wealthy enough as a country that we can have this debate, right? The vast majority of plastics pollution and of ocean pollution is coming from less developed countries. And I say that because there is this idea, you get it every time you get one of these COP meetings, you get all the people saying capitalism is killing the planet, we need to degrowth and we need to be limitarian and all this. It is a reminder that you need to get to a certain level of GDP in order to be able to afford some of these measures. If you're in a country where you're still dependent on indoor cooking, slash and burn agriculture and so on, you just don't have the capacity to do those things. And so if we want to have a cleaner planet, we have to help the rest of the world get to a level of GDP per head where they can afford to take some of the measures that we take for granted.
So, Richard, more growth, more capitalism in order to actually deal with the problems of pollution?
Well, rather than focusing on the growth in the capitalism, I think that as countries, populations naturally want to enjoy the same sort of standards of living as our part of the world do, let's help them to industrialise better. Let's help them to avoid the mistakes that we have made, and let's use the power of our example, and let's use the power of our research and development and our scientific advantages that we have in the Western world to try and make sure that the materials that then become commonplace are ones which do not have an adverse impact on the environment. And that's the best way, rather than saying that the only path to growth and improved standards of living is to follow the one that we've had, because the evidence shows the path that we have followed has not been one which is good or sustainable for the planet.
Right. I mean, new plastic packaging tax, Caroline, is set to be introduced in April. Is that something that will actually achieve a change in behaviour by more companies other than Iceland and perhaps consumers?
I think it has to. I mean, we know that, people are having to make these changes. It costs money. People are incentivised by what they see on the shelves. Consumers are really where it comes down to. And actually not giving consumers necessarily the choice is one of the ways in which you can compel people to start looking after the planet better. And obviously, in terms of introducing taxes, it does mean that there's an incentive for companies to look for more sustainable products in order to, package up their goods. So I think, yes, that's right. I mean, let's just not forget, when we're talking about COP sort of more generally, is that this was one of the aims of the COP summit, was to actually get business to play a part within this and actually to do their role. As we know from some of the debates that we've had about the heating and building strategy in Parliament, for example, otherwise we're just looking at consumers changing their behaviour, voluntarily to go and get new boilers, for example, or heat pumps or one of those things. And of course, it's really difficult to change consumers' behaviour by necessarily offering them incentives when this technology is very expensive to start with. So actually, it has to be a partnership from lots of stakeholders in society to get that kind of change in behaviour, and business is very much part of that.
Do you agree that, Sam,
Absolutely right.
Sorry, Richard, go on, you come in.
No, I was going to say, I mean, obviously I'm a capitalist, but I believe in more intervention when it comes to these existential environmental issues. This packaging tax is going to cost us over £10 million next year. Actually, I don't think that's enough, because we can't wait for the good businesses to rise to the top, and that's why we need a policy framework of sticks and carrots to engender more rapid action by business, to level the playing field. And exactly right, what that does is just spur investment and R&D in, for example, plastic alternatives. So I think we need more regulation, more taxes, and quite frankly, for businesses to shoulder more of the burden.
Right, Sam, what do you make of that?
Customers won't do it on their own.
Well, a businessman like Richard calling for more regulation and more tax to achieve the sorts of changes that are required to hit that net zero.
Always want more regulation.
I think what's important is involving market forces in the process and making sure that there's things like carbon pricing, so that people bear the costs of their actions. Because what something like carbon pricing does is it effectively makes pollution scarce. And when something's scarce, capitalists, business people, entrepreneurs are amazing at finding alternatives and inventing new technologies. I also think there's a role for government in partnership with business to look at how we can sort of seed the grounds for some of these sort of new, potentially revolutionary technologies. There's a thing called direct air capture, which is literally sucking CO2 out of the sky and burying it underground. Many climate scientists think we'll need something like this. The PM actually announced funding for it. And one company, Stripe, the online payments company, is supporting this technology by becoming what's known as a buyer of first resorts. So just as the governments across the world pre-ordered coronavirus vaccines before we knew they worked, Stripe is making a market to give entrepreneurs and investors research to invest in these projects. But I think that's another way that we can help things, by pre-committing to buy sort of the technologies that we know we'll need in the next 10 to 15 years.
Dan, you were trying to say something earlier.
Well, no, I mean, I agree very much with what Sam just said. Of course, there is a legitimate role for government policing externalities. In other words, a cost that a business exports to someone else. I don't think you'll find any free marketeer who disagrees with that. If you're polluting a river, you should bear the cost of that. Or if you're making the climate unstable, you should bear the cost of that. I'd make the point that Sam made, that some of this is counterintuitive. I mean, it is a weird counterintuitive fact that New Zealand lamb consumed in London has a lower carbon footprint than Welsh lamb, because most of the carbon emission is on the farm in the production phase, in fertiliser and tractor fuel and incubators, right? So quite a lot of what we're doing, we should approach in a hard-headed transactional way rather than in a kind of millenarian spirit, a religious spirit. And if we do that, I'm quite optimistic.
Richard, as in not Walker, sorry, Thompson.
Yeah, I think there's a danger in Dan's view that if you're polluting the environment, you can just write a cheque and that makes it good. There is a role for government in terms of regulating and providing the level playing field within which that capitalist activity takes place.
Sorry, I'm not saying you should write a cheque. If the regulation makes it too expensive for you to do that, you'll do something else.
Well, I would prefer that there were just standards that said this: you can either do this or you can't. And if you do it when you said you can't, then you are penalised very, very heavily within the extent of the law. But in order to, as Richard said, you can't wait for the good companies here to rise to the top. There is a pressing need to deal with this now. Government sets the frameworks within which markets operate, and I don't think it should be shy of stepping into that space to make sure that the good companies can rise to the top faster.
All right, we're going to... Oh, thank you to Sam. Thank you for... All right, very good. Yeah, sorry, Richard Walker, go on.
5p carrier bag charge, didn't think it would make any difference, and carrier bag usage dropped 90% literally overnight, which was a triple win because we were spending a fortune on them, giving them away for free. It's obviously great for the environment, but of course that 5p goes to charity, and now there's been hundreds of millions of pounds raised for charity. And by the way, that New Zealand lamb, it depends if it's fresh or frozen, which has a lower carbon footprint.
It is counter-seasonal to our own. It's
all right, I've been trying to end this discussion, and now it is ending. Sam, thank you very much for joining us today to talk about it. We're going to now move on to Brexit. We're going to just show you some pictures from earlier today. The Brexit Minister, Lord David Frost, has arrived. You can see him there at his meeting with France's Europe Minister, Clément Beaune, in Paris to try and resolve an ongoing, I should say, and rather tense dispute over post-Brexit fishing rights. As you know, it sort of exploded to some extent after a British trawler was detained by the French, which has subsequently been released. Dan, it's not the only dispute that is ongoing post-Brexit. There is also the issue of the Northern Ireland Protocol and how the border checks should work and how that protocol is interpreted by the EU. Is this what sovereignty looks like? Does it mean ongoing fractious relationships with our neighbours and flare-ups?
Yes and no. Of course, we will always have disputes with our neighbours. We had them when we were in the EU. I used to be the MEP covering Kent. I was frequently trying to get compensation for hauliers and other businesses disrupted by French blockade. So that's not new, and Brexit isn't on its own going to get rid of them. But is this what sovereignty looks like? In this sense, yes. We have now taken back control of our territorial waters. We've got a higher quota within that. I think we were very responsible. We said, we could... Technically, within the rules, we could have said we're excluding all except our own vessels from these waters, but we didn't do that. We said we would recognise the historic rights of other countries that had a presence there, and we've done so. And we've been very generous, both we, the UK, and the Channel Islands, at recognising boats that had a clear presence there. What this dispute is French boats that plainly do not have that evidence, and in some cases are claiming to have been fishing in our waters when satellite data puts them elsewhere. So there is absolutely no way that we should be giving in to illicit blackmail.
Richard?
Well, I think fishing is one of the classic examples of where the promises of Brexit have not been fulfilled. I represent a seat in the northeast of Scotland. Now, it's been a while since fishing boats sailed out of my constituency, but nevertheless, there's a huge community of affinity with the fishing industry. And the sense of betrayal there between what was promised and what has actually been delivered is palpable, because sovereignty and 200-mile limits aren't putting fish into nets and money into fishermen's bank accounts or fish processors' bank accounts, because there is a flip side of you need to be able to have access to the markets for what you catch, and it's not quite as simple as it was sold to many of the fishing community, to the fishing communities ahead of Brexit, because many of our fishermen are in a position where they're actually in a poorer position than they were under the CFP, because we've lost the ability to swap quota, which means that they are able to catch less of the types of species that they traditionally catch and then market. And I think part of the problem with Brexit is we've yet to come to terms, or the UK government has yet to come to terms with, it turns up in Brussels for negotiations and said, we have sovereignty and we have red lines. And it has to come to terms with the fact that Europe goes, great, we also have sovereignty, we also have red lines, let's discuss, and that we're not going to get our own way all the time in that, and that there is a huge economic and political power imbalance in the relationship that we're now in.
Or Iceland or any other coastal state. But there is no world, Richard, in which this increase of quota is a deterioration on where we were under the common fisheries policy.
I think you should speak to some fishermen in the northeast of Scotland.
You know, I've spoken to some fishermen in the northeast of Scotland who say that the real problem is getting certification for their exports, and that is a Scottish government responsibility.
Right, let me go to Richard Walker. From a business perspective, are you worried about this? Is the price of sovereignty too high?
Of course it's worrying, but I just hope this is early in-flight turbulence and this stuff will be ironed out quite quickly because, you know, let's face it, economically this is quite de minimis. And business has so many issues being thrown at us from the moment. Yes, partly because of Brexit, partly because of energy costs and everything else in between. And least of all the environment as well. You know, we need to hopefully get these smaller issues ironed out and sorted so that we can really focus on the big issues. And it's the last thing that business needs is more complication, paperwork, right, friction, which will slow things down.
Right. I mean, Caroline, do you think these are just growing pains of the new situation or the new normal of our relationship with what Boris Johnson said would be our friends and neighbours, EU states? They're our direct competitors now.
Well, it's difficult, isn't it? And when we see the escalation of tensions last weekend, the suggestion that, you know, France wanted to show that Brexit was damaging to Britain, you know, you can really get a sense of the very heightened tensions that surround these issues. And I think, you know, it would be sort of, I mean, we've talked about escalating, they've talked about de-escalating this row. My understanding is that Number 10 are going into these talks today thinking that it's very likely that the French will not back down on these issues, that they think that we're going to come to the table and be conciliatory. Yes, I mean, I think there's going to be a constant sort of toing and froing of negotiations. And talking to David Frost, as I did at the conference, you know, I said to him, how long do you think you're going to be in a job? And the suggestion was it was going to be ongoing. So, right. You know, there's no suggestion that these discussions are necessarily going to come to an end anytime soon.
Well, Richard Walker, what's your reaction to that? I mean, you backed Leave. Did you anticipate these sorts of problems?
I always knew that there would be problems, of course, but I hope that these are things we can iron out quite quickly. Right. I think some of the government's action is quite self-inflicted. I mean, I mentioned HGV drivers before. Just simply adding them to the skilled worker list would be a very simple solution to get more HGV drivers into this country, because currently we're facing such a shortage of them. So I think, yeah, it's a consequence of Brexit, but some of these issues are perhaps self-inflicted.
Right, and wouldn't there be a similar situation between an independent Scotland and the UK? Or the rest of the UK?
Well, that very much depends on the terms on which we agree that.
Do you think Boris Johnson and Nicola Sturgeon would get on swimmingly over things like?
Possible. I think there'd be robust exchanges of views, but I think the problem we've got with Lord Frost is he gives us very much the impression he's a man who pours oil on troubled waters only to then go and set fire to it. I think a more Mammalian personality might get rid of some of that turbulence.
Well, on that note of turbulence, we're all calm here in the studio. Thank you to all of my guests and thank you for joining me. I'll be back, of course, with Politics UK tomorrow.